Hi everyone, welcome to our public economics class again after a while, after the spring break as well as after some days in which the university administration has cancelled our classes to prepare both you as well as both the faculty members, the instructors, to switch to online teaching. As you all know, we are going through hard times globally and these are in a sense extraordinary times to be in. However, as far as I see, the university administration is trying to do everything possible so that your education, the quality of education and the level of education as well as your graduation plans are not adversely affected by this. And I will also be basically trying to provide you any help that I can give you, especially regarding our lecture public economics, regarding our class public economics. And now this is our first lecture, or actually the second lecture after the university has switched to online teaching. But in the first one, we basically, as you might remember, and most of you were already still there, still in New York City at that time. We watched a documentary and shortly discussed that. From today onwards, I aim to continue my lectures on different topics related to public economics. And some of you might sort of have difficult time to motivate yourself to study or to sort of read the material, do the assignments. But as you all know, the university also has switched to a pass-fail grading policy, which will also basically be helpful for those of you who are going through difficult times, which is actually most of you, including me. I will continue to talk about public economics in the rest of the semester and aim to finish, if not all, a large fraction of the chapters or the topics that were outlined in the syllabus of the course. So now today I will continue. Remember, last time we have discussed topics related to inequality, different inequality measures. You have solved the question on how to calculate the Gini index during the midterm exam, as you might all remember. I will wrap it up basically today, the inequality and poverty stuff, and talk about a little bit about the handbook provided by the World Bank that I have already uploaded to Courseworks, especially a specific section of that chapter 4, which is on measures of poverty. And then I will continue to talk about a bit inequality and several welfare programs from chapter 17 of our textbook. And then from the next lecture onwards, which is going to be the next Tuesday, I will continue to talk about public goods, basically. That's the plan. And also, again, I'm not saying you sort of to motivate you for this course, but you must be aware of the fact that we are really going through times in terms of economic policy where we really need a solid understanding of public economics. These are times in which in all the countries, not only in the United States, but from my own country, Turkey, as well as in other developed as well as developing nations, public economics, a solid understanding of public economics, a solid understanding of public policy is very much needed. As you might be, following the news all around the world, governments are trying to introduce, or are intervening the so-called free markets and introducing different policy tools, like welfare programs, employment guarantees, printing money to some extent, and not only save the financial system as it was in the case of 2008 crisis, but basically to save the labor market, to save the goods market, to save the supply chain, and to overcome the economic crisis that will accompany the public health crisis. Of course, I'm not a public health expert, so I don't want to talk much about this pandemic and sort of this COVID-19 as well as the virus that causes it. But it is obvious to everyone that we are currently globally in a public health crisis, as well as in an economic crisis. And the economic crisis is mostly largely due to the public health crisis. Of course, people were talking about that the economy was already fragile even before the COVID-19 or before the pandemic, and it was about to burst and so on. So the bubble was about to burst and so on and so forth. but foremost, we are in a public health crisis. That's sort of something that we should underline. Therefore, in my sincere opinion, currently government should do everything possible, that is, to eradicate this pandemic, or sort of to overcome this public health crisis. That's sort of the must before going into the discussion of how the public economics, or how the governments can respond in the economics front. First, the public health issue should be solved. Then, we can start discussing about how the government can intervene to overcome this. That's sort of my 50 cents basic sort of for this ongoing crisis. Now, going back to our class, so we are gonna now discuss different poverty measures from this chapter 4 of the Handbook on Poverty and Inequality published by the World Bank, and then I will go to chapter 17 slides, not to the 26th slide, but to the first slide of the textbook, in which we will discuss income distribution and welfare programs. And some of the welfare programs actually are nowadays, discussed among policy circles, because some governments believe that those welfare programs can be used to address the current issues that we have on the economics front. Anyway, so if you go to chapter 4 of this handbook, which is already uploaded for your information, you will see that there are different measures of poverty that I will shortly discuss, not in full length, but shortly discuss. So the question here is basically, how to measure poverty. That's sort of, in a sense, like even before developing any, policy towards eradicating poverty or towards reducing poverty, we need to agree on how to measure poverty. We have seen different measures of inequality before. Remember the share ratio, the Gini index, and some other indices that were proposed in the literature. All the indices have certain problems, and they have some sort of advantages, disadvantages. This is also true for the poverty indices. But still, it does not basically prevent us from discussing and defining first, and then discussing these indices in the first place. So when we look at those different indices, the first index that we are going to see is going to be the headcount index. I'm going to define it, but intuitively and basic, it's basic, the proportion of the population that is poor. Of course, it's now very easy to define this, like, the proportion of the population that is poor, but then the question is, how are you going to define the poor? That's a question that we are going to answer in a minute. Then we have a poverty gap index, which has been developed basically to address certain deficiencies of the first index, the headcount index. It measures the extent to which individuals fall below the poverty line as a proportion of the poverty line. Okay? So we'll see which sort of deficiencies it overcomes. And then there is the squared poverty gap index, and then some other sort of special indices as well. One of them is a sort of Sands-Shorrock-Stone index, named after the people who basically sort of developed the index. Because, all of these indices have certain problems, similar to the inequality indices or inequality measures. All of these measures have certain problems. And, sort of in order to see, like, whether a public policy or public welfare program works or not, we need to have these measures, because, if you want to reduce poverty, we need to sort of, first of all, define the poverty, measure the poverty, and then when we sort of apply a policy, then hopefully, those measures are going to go down. But if we don't have a measure in the first place, we cannot observe whether they go down or don't change significantly, or even maybe, the policy is not working, it is even going up. So that's why those measures are basically, quite important. Okay? Now, let me start with discussing the first sort of the simplest measure, the most widely used measure. Of course, the issue is that when you make the measure more and more sophisticated, then you need more and more data to create that index. And especially in a bunch of developing economies, or, less developed economies, those data series might be hard to collect, and therefore, it might be difficult to sort of exactly calculate, to truly calculate those measures. Anyway, so if we first look at the headcount index, it's basically a very simple formula. P0 is our headcount index formula, and it is defined as this ratio N sub P divided by N, which is basically, the whole population is in the denominator, and then in the numerator we have the poor, the number of poor. Okay. Now, of course, the question is going to be, how are you going to define the number of poor? For that, you may want to say, you may want to come up with different definitions. You need to define a poverty line first. And then you are going to say, if you define a poverty line, those people who are above the line, you are going to define them not poor. And those who are below the line, you are going to define them as poor. But then how are you going to define the poverty line? There are different sort of discussions about that, whether we should define it in terms of consumption or in terms of income. But a simple definition could be, in the case of the United States, for example, one could say, everyone who is below, who has an, income, pre-tax income of $10,000 and less are considered to be poor. In that case, the $10,000 level is going to be your poverty line, and then you can define all the people below that as poor. So, of course, how are you going to, collect the number of poor? In that case, you are going to basically, most likely run a survey, conduct a survey, and let's say if you do a survey of 300 people, and then 60 of them, if they are under the poverty line, then you are going to call them poor. So 60 divided by 300, in that case, is going to be 20%, is going to be your P0 measure, the head count ratio. Okay, so here there's a sort of a some more sophisticated sort of way of writing the same definition. Here we are defining an indicator function that takes the value of 1 if the expression here in the parentheses is true and 0 otherwise. That is, if your income is yi and the poverty line is z, if it is less than the poverty line, then it takes the value of 1, so you are counted as poor. If not, you are counted as not poor, and then the indicator variable takes the value of 0. Then you can sum up all these indicators for the poor guys, and if there are 60 of them, you end up with 60 here as a number, and you divide it by the population and 300, and you end up with this 20%. So here we have sort of two fictional countries, country A, country B. Now it defines the poverty line in terms of expenditure. It doesn't have to be in terms of income. You can do it in terms of expenditure, consumption, as I said. And let's say there are 4 people. The population in both countries A and B is 4, which is quite small, but that's sort of just a pedagogic example. And we assume that the poverty line is 125. So we are going to consider everyone below this as poor and above this as not poor. Now we have these two countries. In country A, 4 guys have those respective incomes, 100, 100, 150, and 150. And in country B, they have these incomes given here, 124, 124, 150, 150. And now, as you can see, using this definition of poverty, P0 definition of poverty, that is the poverty, the head count ratio, in both countries, the poverty rate is going to be 50%, because in both countries, 2 guys are below the poverty line and 2 guys are above the poverty line, which means that the poverty head count ratio is 50%. Now, if you compare these two countries, now if you look at the data, country A has a poverty ratio of, head count ratio of 50%, which is our measure of poverty, and in country B it's also 50%. Oh, then the poverty is, the extent at which the poverty is a problem is the same in both of these countries. Now, is this really true? That's the question. It is not. Why? Because as you can see, this measure does not basically, incorporate how sort of far away you are from the poverty line. Because here you are, these 2 guys are really, far away from the poverty line, because the poverty line is 125. But in country B, these 2 guys are very, very slightly below the poverty line, which is not much. So that is why a sort of an ideal measure of poverty should not really be the same in these 2 countries, but the head count ratio is the same. That is why, here the head count index is unsatisfactory. Okay, so that's sort of, in a sense, an issue. Okay. Of course, there are also other technical reasons why it is not unsatisfactory. Why it is unsatisfactory. But as I said, I'm not going to go into the details much. But I think this example fairly well illustrates why it is problematic. Now, if you go to now for the poverty gap index, it is slightly sort of more sophisticated index. It's called the moderately popular measure of poverty. Now, in this case, we define the poverty using this formula. Again, we are summing up something over all these people that we surveyed, let's say, and divided by the population. But then the sort of term G here is somewhat more sophisticated. It's defined in this equation, the index function. We are not just now counting the number of people, but we are also counting how far they are from the poverty line. So here, as you can see, this G function is has two components, and they are multiplied with each other. The second component is still the indicator function. If you are below the poverty line, it takes the value of 1 and 0 otherwise. But then we also have this new component here in which we are basically subtracting your income from the poverty line. In a sense, it is here because we want to incorporate how far you are away from the poverty line. So if this value is larger, it means that you are really well below the poverty line. Because if the poverty line is Z and your income is 0, it's Z minus 0. But if the poverty line is Z, let's say 125, and your income is 100, it is 125 minus 100, it's 25, it's much less. So if you are further away from the, further below the poverty line, this number goes up and vice versa. And therefore, if we define the G function like this and put it in here, and then divide by the poverty line, sum it over all these peoples, and then divide by n, we end up with the poverty gap index. Now, in these two countries that we have previously seen, we can now calculate this new measure of poverty, which is the poverty gap index, and then try to see whether this is a better measure or not. And actually, if we can, So here, now if we have a situation like this, like if we have a country like 100, 110, 150, 160, now to calculate the poverty gap in the first place, we just take the definition, need to subtract 120, we just need to subtract 100 from 125, 110 from 125. Then for these two guys who are above the poverty line, it is 0 because those guys are not poor, because the indicator function takes the value of 0 in that case. So we just basically include those two here, divide by the poverty line, which is 125. So 25 divided by 125 makes 20%. 15 divided by 125 makes 12%. You sum them over and divide by n, and you get 0.08 as your poverty gap index. Now it is basic, assignment for all of you to calculate the poverty gap index P1 using these two countries, these two imaginary countries that we have seen a few minutes ago. And then you are going to realize that now P1 is going to differ for those two countries, even though P0 is the same. In that sense, P1 is a better measure. Okay, so far so good. Then, now, poverty gap index is still somewhat problematic. Why? So in order to see the poverty gap index is still problematic, we need to focus on this example. Here, again, we have two imaginary countries, A and B. Poverty line is still the same, 125. And those two guys are still not poor, but these two guys are, the first two guys are poor in both. Now look at this. In the first country, country A, the first guy has 99, the second guy has 101. Whereas in the second country, the second guy is a bit richer and the first guy is a bit poorer. Now the question is, are these two countries equally poor, or do these two countries suffer equally from poverty? Most likely not. Your intuition should say no. But look at the poverty gap and headcount index. They are both the same. The headcount index is still 50% because two guys are below the poverty line. And the P1 is 10% in both because the P1 only looks at the how far you are away in a linear way from the poverty line. So this guy, for example, is the difference between 125 and 99 is 26. So 26 is used here as your sort of distance between the poverty line and this guy's income, and 24 for this guy. Now if you just, add 20 to this guy and subtract 20 from this guy, these distances, the sum of these two distances don't change. And therefore, when you calculate the P1 index, you end up with the same P1 index, which is still 10%. But as you know, my intuition basically says that in country B, poverty is more of a problem. Or maybe not, I don't know. But you know, my intuition, because this guy is really suffering from poverty in this country, whereas this guy is, you know, almost not poor. Whereas here, these two guys are both suffering from poverty, but at a lesser degree. You know, some could say, oh, maybe, you know, of course, it's somewhat subjective whether you should say, you should sort of classify country A more suffering from poverty or country B suffering more from poverty. You know, that's sort of the issue here. That is why you need to basically, you know, this squared poverty gap index is basic, you know, almost the same as the previous one, the poverty gap index, except that we are now squaring this term over here. Squaring basically means we are giving more weight, we are putting more weight to people who are more far away from the poverty line. Like this guy, for example. Because when we square, you know, that sort of distance is going to be squared and it's going to get larger and larger. That is why, I don't remember whether it was calculated here, but so for example, we can calculate this poverty gap index for this hypothetical country and still, you know, get a measure of the poverty gap. Of course, you know, some people, so here as you can see, there is this sort of squared, sorry, I cannot sort of, yeah, no, I can shade it, but anyway, so you have this number 2 over here in the exponent of this function, whereas in the previous one, you know, it is as if we have sort of this parenthesis here and there is this exponent 1 here. So poverty gap index is basically, you know, to the power of 1, poverty square index is to the power of 2, and some people argued that you can end up with sort of a more generalized version of this index where you put a number alpha here, which can be a number larger than 0, 1, 2, even if actually, you know, 0 if you want, but also, you know, potentially 1 and 2. Because 0 basically means you are going back to the head count index, 1 means that you are using the poverty gap index, and 2 means that you are using the poverty gap squared index. That is why actually we have this sort of P subscript alpha here. 0 means, remember, P0 is the head count ratio, 1 means the poverty gap index, 2 means, P2 means poverty squared index. Okay? And you can calculate poverty, different poverty measures here. So, you know, here, for example, we have data, apparently data from Madagascar, a sub-Saharan African economy, where we can look at the head count index as well as the poverty index, or the poverty severity index, or the poverty gap squared index, in other words, for different professions, and then, you know, compare and contrast. And as you can see here, the ranks change a little bit. You know, for example, according to the head count ratio, unskilled workers head count ratio is 62.7, which means 62.7 of the unskilled workers, 62.7% of unskilled workers are suffering from poverty or are below the poverty line using the head count ratio. And those guys are, we can see, for example, are having a much higher head count ratio compared to herders and fishermen, retirees and the handicapped, because this 62.7 is higher than 51 and 50 respectively. Whereas now if you look at the poverty gap index, now these unskilled workers have 25.5, whereas the herders and fishermen have 27.9. It seems that as if those guys, herders and fishermen, seem to suffer more from poverty compared to unskilled workers, even though according to P0 they were not. And, you know, if you go to P2, things further change a little bit. So, you know, what I'm trying to show here is that, or what this table trying to illustrate is basically that, you know, rankings of different professions or income groups may change, you know, in terms of how much they suffer from poverty if you use different poverty measures. That's sort of the gist, the moral of the story here. There are also other indices, the SAN index, the Sands-Sherlock-Stone index. I'm not going to go into the details, but, you know, generally what changes is you know, how sort of much you should weight the really poor, or extremely poor, or moderately poor, or those who are slightly below the poverty line. And because, you know, depending on how you weight those, the poverty measures might change. That is why different indices are developed here. And also, you know, poverty is not a concept of, or here at least, like, you know, in this sort of measures, it is obvious that poverty is seen as a phenomenon of income. Like, you are poor because your income is less, or you are poor because your consumption because of income is less. It is basically sort of a monetary, or, you know, sort of a peculiar poverty. Whereas, of course, some people might argue that, you know, there are also sort of other dimensions of poverty, like social poverty, you know, psychological poverty even. But of course, you know, those are not addressed here. This is just economic poverty. Okay. Okay. So far so good for these poverty measures. Now, I want to close this file and switch to the discussion of income distribution and welfare programs following chapter 17 of your textbook. Remember, we have covered up to chapter 6 so far, and then we did not go to chapter 7 because, you know, I wanted to talk about inequality. I talked about my own slides that I have borrowed from a friend of mine back from Turkey, Orhan Torul, and or largely borrowed. And then I also told you that I will discuss chapter 17 of your textbook, which is on income distribution and welfare programs. Then we are going to go, after we are done with the slides of chapter 17, after we are done with chapter 17, we will be jumping back to public goods chapter, which is chapter 7 of your textbook, if I am not mistaken. Now, as I have mentioned to you earlier before, the income inequality discussion that we have made so far was mostly from a macroeconomic point of view. Now, this chapter is, and again, as I have mentioned to you before, this chapter of your textbook is written mostly from a microeconomic point of view. You will see, maybe realize the difference once we are done with this chapter. So that's sort of the chapter's outline. You know, we are going to look at the income distribution facts. We have looked at a bunch of facts before, so I'm going to mostly skip those parts, but very quickly go over it. Then we are going to look at the welfare policy in the United States. Then we are going to look at the moral hazard costs of welfare policy. Then we are going to look at reducing the moral hazard of welfare. Of course, we should define what we mean by moral hazard costs of welfare policy before, in order to discuss it properly. But those of you who have taken game theory, or who have sort of seen some game theoretical models in microeconomics courses that you have taken before, might be familiar with the concept of moral hazard, which is one of the sort of, you know, very popular terms used in game theory. And then we are going to discuss the universal basic income, which is also, you know, a very popular policy proposal right now, as we are going through this public health origined crisis. Okay, so, you know, the introduction starts with some sort of differences in the income inequality, or differences in inequality. You know, it starts with, you know, the differences in income inequality, as well as inequality in other dimensions, like the life expectancy. So this is a map of, apparently, I have never been to Baltimore, but apparently this is a map of the city of Baltimore, which is a very heterogeneous city, and also, you know, the income inequality, the level of income inequality is relatively high compared to the rest of the United States, as far as I know. And this inequality is not only, the inequality in the city does not manifest itself only in terms of income, but it also is apparent in terms of, for example, a key development indicator, life expectancy, which is lower in most likely poorer areas of the city and higher in suburbs and in richer neighborhoods of the city. So this inequality, or income inequality, is not only inequality in income, basically, it's also inequality in a bunch of other dimensions. We have seen the Great Gatsby curve before, in which we have discussed the level of inequality is also positively correlated with, in a sense, the persistence of inequality, because, you know, it affects the intergenerational immobility. So if you are poor, you tend to stay poor, or your offsprings tend to stay poor, unfortunately. At least there is a positive correlation. And one reason of this is that the income inequality, or inequality, is not only income inequality, but also inequality in other dimensions like education, life expectancy, access to healthcare. And that's actually why the US policymakers right now are very much concerned of the effects of this COVID-19, because a lot of people in this country don't have access to proper healthcare, if any. And the numbers that are circulated in the media, at least as far as I follow, I'm not a US health care policy expert, but 80 million people are either not insured or underinsured. Anyway, and that's why actually I'm sure that, like, if you look at this map, if in the neighborhoods where the life expectancy is lower, most likely the access to healthcare, the access to education, nutrition, they are all ranked lower, I'm sure. So there is some sort of real life examples here. Like, for example, 15 Baltimore neighborhoods have a life expectancy below that of North Korea. North Korea is basically, this poster boy for, free market economists to, in a sense, to illustrate how bad a planned economy might perform. But, now you see that in a significant number of neighborhoods of Baltimore, the life expectancy is even lower than North Korea, which has been suffering from malnutrition and hunger over a large number of years, as you might know. So that is why governments of developed economies are using public economics or public policy to address these issues. And of course, to address these issues, that might, of course, you can address them in the long run, so that you make those guys more educated, help them to have access to healthcare, help them to get employed indirectly. But also, in the short run, for those guys, to sort of survive, to get some proper healthcare, to get some education, you have to run some welfare programs so that, they get enough food, they get enough education, they get, if not enough, at least some healthcare, and so on and so forth. That's sort of the job of the governments, basically. Okay. Now, of course, there are always sort of some criticisms towards the welfare programs, especially on the ideological front, and some sort of free market economists or some conservatives are against the introduction of these policy programs for different concerns, like efficiency concerns might be one of them. And but I'm not gonna provide you a solution by the end of this chapter, but I want you to see both sides of the story and then ending up with your own conclusion, whether those programs are useful or not. Now, there is some sort of facts on income distribution in the United States. We have seen some facts, especially cross-country facts, before in my own slides. But now, if you look at the textbook slides, what we can see is that this is, the income, sort of this income distribution, basically, of the United States. And you can calculate the Gini from here, basically, if I ask you to. And then, so like here we have now the full income distribution data in different years, up from 1967 to 2016. Ranking, from lowest 20%, highest 20. And what we can see, for example, here is like from 1967 to 2016, the fraction of income out of the total income of the country that the richest 20% gets has gone up from 43% or 44% to 51.5%. Whereas the income of the poorest 20% has gone down from 4% to almost 3%, which is quite significant. So basically the ratio, 8 to 20, 20 to 20 ratio, whatever you call it, 43 divided by 4 here, 51.5 divided by 3 here. So it has gone up, basically, from 10 to almost 17, right? Which is really high. And of course you can calculate the Gini index. You will also notice that most likely Gini is going up. and we have this sort of second 20, so the middle class is more or less like here, or the supposedly middle class. The third 20% is losing, the second 20% is also losing their shares, and the fourth 20% is also losing their shares, more or less. So the only one who gets richer is the top 20%. Or of course, if you make it this time, this is now in quantiles, in 20% intervals. You could do it in deciles, in 10%, or if you have data in actually in 1% intervals, and then you are going to see that top 1%, top 10% is further going up, which is a concern. That because income inequality is going up, they call it relative income inequality in this slide. Now, so this is the share of the total income accruing to top 1%. We have seen this curve before in Piketty's presentation as well throughout the 20th century, so I'm not going to spend much time here. We have already discussed this, and now we have some sort of cross-country comparison with other countries, where we look at the bottom 10% or bottom 20%. As you can see, for example, like bottom 20% in US is getting between 4 and 3%, and top 20% is getting between 43 and 51%. Now, if you look at these other sort of OECD economies, which is the country club of the UN, as you all know, in top 20% is getting less compared to the US top 20% in those countries. These are more or less, the social welfare states, so to speak, the European countries, right? And the bottom 20%, which is getting between 4 and 3% in US, and this is 2016 actually. 2016 is the year in which the bottom 20% gets 3.1% in the US. Whereas in these countries it's much higher, like Czech Republic it's 9.8, a former communist country. Denmark, a Scandinavian welfare economy, it's 9.6. Finland, it's 9.7, another Scandinavian welfare economy. Greece, which has been going through a very harsh recession or depression, so to speak, from 2016 onwards, and 2008 onwards, sorry, and 2016 was still, in a year in which it still did not go out of a recession. It is 6.4%. So, which is basically sort of an indicator of how bad the bottom 20% in the US is doing compared to these countries. And again, the highest is Greece, but again still below the US figure, even in 1967. And in all these countries, the top 20% is getting a much lower share compared to the top 20% of the US. But then there are some other countries which are which might be sort of doing somewhat more similarly compared to US. For example, if you look at the Mexico, which is more or less like the US, first, at least in terms of the top 20% income, but even in Mexico, the bottom 20% is getting more than the bottom 20% of the US. So, of course, when we say more, it is not, it does not mean that the poorest of Mexico are richer than the poorest of the US, because these are all percentages of the total income. Of course, poorest of the Mexico is poorer than the poorest of US. It's obvious, but because the US per capita income is much larger than the Mexican per capita income, but it's in relative terms, like in terms of the share of the pie that they receive out of the total income. Okay. And then we have other countries like Turkey is here, for example, again doing better than US in terms of this measure of income inequality, and again still lower, somewhat better, slightly better, I can say maybe, than US compared to, if you look at this top 20% income. Of course, you may also want to look at the bottom 10%, top 10%. These are also, in a sense, good indicators to compare and contrast these issues. Now, so we have discussed what, poverty line, or, we made some poverty discussion when we discussed these poverty measures in the World Bank Handbook. But of course, here in this slide, it's basic, the textbook is trying to motivate you why inequality does not measure poverty, or inequality, or income inequality, I should say, is not the only measure of poverty or deprivation. that is why sort of different or additional concepts are very much needed. One of them is the absolute deprivation, and another one is the poverty line, which we have slightly seen, in the handbook. The absolute deprivation is defined as the amount of income the poor have relative to some measure of minimally acceptable income. In certain countries, trade unions or statistical institutes that are responsible for calculating national income statistics publish those statistics. Like in Turkey, for example, we have this poverty line, we have this hunger line, published by mostly trade unions. But in different countries, different institutions, sometimes non-governmental organizations, NGOs are doing this kind of studies. And then the poverty line is the federal government standard for measuring absolute deprivation. Here in the US, when the government is doing some welfare programs targeting some of the poor, and with some welfare payments that are using this federal poverty line. And those of you who have been paying taxes or maybe buying healthcare from the marketplace, it's sort of this federally or state subsidized healthcare insurance policy after the Obama 2008 healthcare reform, might be familiar with those concepts. But there is also a federal government in the US official poverty line that determines how much taxes you pay or whether you are eligible to get some sort of healthcare benefits from the federal government or from the state government, and so on and so forth. Of course, generally these poverty lines, when they are determining those, even if trade unions or governmental institutions, doesn't matter, they are trying to determine this with, generally they are nutrition-based measures, how much calories you need to get per day to survive. And then, of course, you are multiplying by 30 if you want to have a monthly measure, or maybe 365 if you want to get a yearly measure. Of course, those sort of this basket of goods that are in those, the basket, the structure of the basket, the goods that you put into the basket, and you define this line. Of course, they are very much open to discussion. Which goods you should put there? Just mac and cheese, maybe, because one can survive by eating mac and cheese. Mac and cheese, one of the cheapest goods that you can get to eat, and you can survive by eating mac and cheese 30 days in a month. But now the question is, should you create a basket with only 30 mac and cheese, or maybe 30 times 3 mac and cheese? It's going to be a very cheap basket most likely, but should you define the poverty line like this? That's a question. Then do you need to add some sort of healthcare payments, or do you need to add some rents, maybe if you are renting an apartment, or maybe transportation fees? What does poverty mean? That's sort of, in a sense, a subjective question, unfortunately. That's why the definition of poverty line will also change from one institution to another, or from one person to another. It's a bit subjective, that's what I'm trying to say. Here we have this federal poverty line based on 2018 figures, defined by the Department of Health and Human Services, depending on the size of the family. If you are just an individual, it's $12,140 in US. If you are a family of 4, it's $25,100 basically. And then that's sort of a guideline that gives you. Of course, it might also change from one city to another. Like 40, I don't know. If you have $25,000, and if you are a family of 4, and if you are living in a rural area of Idaho, let's say, or Wyoming, maybe you can survive well with that money, even though you are still considered federally poor. Let's say you have $25,000, slightly below this poverty line, you are going to be considered as poor federally. The federal government is going to consider you as a poor family. But if you are living in New York City, but you might be doing well in Idaho, in a rural area of Idaho maybe. But if you are in New York City, it's $25,000 is going to be much less actually in terms of purchasing power. That's why actually some people argue that those federal poverty lines should also be adjusted according to where you live. Anyway, so that's sort of just a sort of concern. And now when we define this, when we just take this poverty line defined by the federal government as the relevant poverty line, even though it may have some problems, and then look at the poverty rate in US, this head count ratio. I mean, when I say poverty rate, it's the head count ratio, the percentage of people, most likely, and it was much higher before 1960s. It has drastically gone down, and then it fluctuates, oscillated, or in a sense, over time. And we see that, like, for example, the old people one is the red one, which is basically showing that around something in between 10 and 15% of the whole population is considered to be federally considered to be poor or suffering from poverty. But it was much higher before, in 1960s, or even in 1950s, late 1950s. That's sort of the welfare programs, the Great Society programs, maybe of John F. Kennedy administration might help of that, might be help of in reducing those rates. And then it basically oscillated, not much going up or down, and then it started to go down a lot after 2010. Of course, I'm not very happy to say this, but I am sure that it's gonna jump up quite substantially throughout this public health based crisis, unfortunately. Now there are different problems. So as I said, it's these poverty lines, economists don't have a consensus upon them. Why? The bundle, the basket changes. The difference, for example, like in 1960s, you most likely wouldn't have the mobile phone, or the cost that you need to pay to a carrier a month in the basket. But now even homeless people have mobile phones. They should. It is maybe sort of a right to communicate, right? And now do you need to include mobile phones in the basket or not is a question, for example, and the answer might be subjective. And then, as I said, differences in cost of living, income definition, like Medicaid does not count toward poverty line. So those are the things that is sort of like, even for example, after the question is even okay, so the poverty line might be 20%, 15%, 10%, whatever. If those guys are eligible to receive welfare payments from the government, and once they receive, now the question is, do they go above the poverty line or not? Now the question is then, should we count, or should we define poverty as, should we define the poverty rate after those welfare payments or before those welfare payments is another question. So there are sort of different sort of questions that is being discussed among policy circles, among scientists, among economists. Okay, so the question is, of course, when we define this poverty, when we discuss poverty, and then when we accept that the government, federal or state, should do something about the poverty, should address the poverty with policy. Now we need that, in order to discuss it, we need to discuss the welfare programs, because the governments are addressing these poverty issues with welfare programs. Now, your textbook is categorizing the welfare programs under two categories. One of them is a categorical welfare program, another one is a means-tested welfare program. Now, categorical welfare program is, you need to be in a category in order to be eligible to receive this. Like, for example, you need to be a single mother in order to benefit from the single motherhood program. Like, you need to be a woman, you need to have a kid, and you don't, you need to be single. Okay. So, you two should be alone in your household. That's sort of a category. You need to be in that category to be eligible. Or, sometimes, like, the government may have a welfare program for American Indians. Then you need to be, American Indian recognized by a tribe to benefit from the program. So that's basically, sort of, or, I don't know, if the area that you live in suffers from Hurricane Katrina, for example, in New Orleans. You need to be a New Orleans resident to utilize that welfare program. So you need to be in that category. On the other hand, there is also this means-tested welfare program, it is restricted only by income and asset levels. You know, your income should be below this, your asset level should be below that, and so on and so forth. Okay? And generally, we will see these categorical welfare programs are, maybe I shouldn't say better or more efficient, but generally they are more preferred. Why? We'll see. Now, also, in terms of other categorization, welfare programs can also be in kind or cash. Cash means, you know, you get some monetary benefits. And in kind means you are not getting monetary benefits, but you are getting non-monetary benefits, like, you know, medical care, housing, public housing, or some certain goods that you really need. You know, the government may give some sort of educational goods to your kids, textbooks, you know, some sort of books, pens, pencils, whatever, you know, whatever they need, in tablets even. Whatever they need in their education. And the cash welfare program is, as their name suggests, they are cash programs. They may involve benefit guarantee, which is like, you know, the cash welfare benefit for individuals with no other income, which may be reduced as income increases. So if you have zero income, you get some benefit, but as long as you earn more and more income, let's say by working, that's going to get reduced. So the government can say, you know, we have seen this kind of programs before, you are familiar with this, but, you know, the government may give, independent of work, $10,000 with zero work, let's say. If I don't have any other source of income, I get $10,000 monthly. Oh, no, monthly is too much. Yearly, annually, $10,000, let's say. And then for each $1,000 that I work, that I earn from the labor market, my benefit is reduced at a rate of 50%, 40%, 60%, 100% even, you know. You know this from the temporary assistance for needy families program that we have analyzed in chapter 2. And therefore, you know, so the benefit reduction rate is basically, you know, defined per this, the rate at which welfare benefits are reduced per dollar of other income earned. So two prominent cash welfare programs used in US. We have seen the first one, TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, so I'm not going to discuss that. And also there is the supplemental security income, serves aged, you know, old people, blind people, disabled people. That's sort of, in a sense, a supplemental income, providing supplemental income to those guys that are in need. And examples of in-kind programs are SNAP, which is quite popular, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It gives you a debit card that you can use to buy food from private groceries. I know it, you know, in New York City you may see, you know, if you are living in a neighborhood where this sort of the SNAP penetration rate is high. I am living in such a neighborhood where I see a lot of people when I wait in the cashier in a grocery, that people are paying with their SNAP cards that the government provides them to buy food. Then the Medicaid is, you know, sort of the largest category of the welfare program if you are needed, if you don't have enough money to provide, to buy health care. Public housing, you know, in a bunch of states, cities, there are public housing, especially in New York City. You must have seen different public housing units in different neighborhoods of the city. And there are other additional programs like school lunch, breakfast programs, which was a concern, actually, you might remember. The number of students who rely on school lunch and breakfast programs in New York City, one of the richest cities in the world, maybe the richest city in the world, that rely on those programs is huge. That is why the city, the mayor, de Blasio, was hesitant to close the schools, you know, at the start of this pandemic, because, you know, those kids are really in need of, you know, people were saying, I don't know how much it's true, but people were saying that the only meal those kids are getting in a day, some kids at least, are the food which is served in the schools, lunches and breakfasts. So if the schools get closed, you know, those kids are gonna basically, you know, are not gonna get enough nutrition. That's why, even though now the schools are closed in the city, they are still serving foods on a, you know, grab and go basis. You know, kids are going there, grabbing food and go out. They can't stay in the school, but due to the pandemic, but they can get the food out of the school. These are really substantial programs and important programs for the needy. Now, of course, though, we have, somewhat we have seen that before, but it is. I'm not gonna, talk this in full detail. But what I want to stress out here is that some of the means-tested transfer systems might have moral hazard effects. Moral hazard meaning that if you are relatively close to the poverty line, or if you are relatively close to benefit from whatever the program is, and the program is introduced, then you may, even though you had some outside opportunities, you may, tend to work less and just utilize the program. That's sort of the moral hazard. In a sense, we have seen that a little bit when we discuss TANF, where we have seen that the introduction of the TANF program reduces labor supply. In a sense, it reduces efficiency. But now it's also apparent that if I'm relatively close to, let's say I'm slightly above the poverty line, or whatever program which is introduced in terms of income, for example, which is why it's a means-tested program. If I'm fairly close to utilize from it, like fairly above the level, then I may cut my work so that I utilize the program with zero work maybe. So that's, in a sense, in the introduction, the idea here is like the critics of those programs are arguing that those programs might introduce some moral hazard problems, and that is why in a sense they are not effective, or they are not efficient. Okay, and people who are arguing against those are claiming that in order to overcome this efficiency, we might in a sense reduce the benefit rate maybe, but then once we do that, then there are other problems. Those of you who have taken open economy macroeconomics might be familiar with the concept of the impossible trinity of open economy macro. Like one cannot, if I remember correctly, one cannot have a fixed exchange rate, independent monetary policy, and free capital flows at the same time. You need to choose two out of these three options. That's called impossible trinity in open economy macroeconomics. We have a similar concept here in public, which is called the iron triangle, which is defined here. There is no way to change either the benefit reduction rate or the benefit guarantee to simultaneously encourage work, redistribute more income, and lower costs. So you cannot achieve those three at the same time. You cannot, encourage work, redistribute more income, or lower costs. You need to basically choose two out of three in a sense here as well. Either you will redistribute more income and lower costs, but then discourage work a little bit, there will be some moral hazard problems, or you will encourage work and lower costs, but then you cannot redistribute much income, because if you reduce the benefit rate substantially, or the third option is basically you can encourage work and redistribute more income, but then you cannot have lower costs, you will have huge costs. So you need to choose two out of the three. So that's why sometimes people argue that this means-tested programs that we have defined here, are not that effective. That's why we need to more focus on categorical welfare programs. Let me now jump to this discussion here. So, in order to get around this triangle, to overcome this, there are three proposals in the policy circles. One is the moving to categorical welfare payments, as I said. The second one is using ordeal mechanisms, which I'm going to define, or increasing outside options. Now, moving to categorical welfare payments is basically assuming that the moral hazard arises because the government wants to redistribute to poor people, but people control their income. They respond. When the government is following a policy, people respond to that policy. Okay, they change their amount of work, they change their amount of level, the amount of their income. So you cannot just assume that, those guys are earning that much, now I am applying this policy and helping those guys. But maybe, when you start this particular welfare policy program, then the guys that you are targeting will change their behavior. So their behavior is not basically static, but instead dynamic. That is why, you know, some people argue that you know, in a sense, these categorical welfare payments are much more efficient than the means-tested welfare programs. For example, what kind of categorical programs? Like persons with disabilities. You are only eligible. You cannot just, you know, disable yourself just to utilize from the disability program, or you cannot just suddenly become a single mother just to utilize a program targeting single mothers. That is why, you know, in a sense, it's sort of reducing people's responses or, you know, dynamic behavior against those programs. So it's in a sense like you are targeting, in a sense, in a way that there is no way to change behavior in order to qualify. You cannot become a single mother just to utilize it, and then you should target people with low earning capacity. And, you know, here is a sort of example of, even though welfare benefits has gone up and down towards single mothers, the, you know, sort of the fraction of children with single mothers did not respond directly to that. So, like here, time series evidence show that in 1960s, single motherhood and welfare benefits rose in lockstep. In subsequent years, even though the welfare benefits are going down, you know, the fraction is slightly going up. So there is no sort of direct causal mechanism from welfare payments to, you know, the fraction of people utilizing these programs potentially. Then there is also this discussion of ordeal mechanisms. Remember, now we are now discussing how to sort of overcome these moral hazard issues. One issue that we discussed was this categorical programs. The second one is basically the so-called ordeal mechanisms, which is like, you know, the features of the welfare programs. Let's read the definition together. The features of welfare programs that make them unattractive, leading to the self-selection of only most needy recipients. So you are basing, sort of making those programs only available to those who really, you know, want to benefit from them, by creating some disincentives or dismotivations not to utilize from that. What you can do is, for example, you know, in order to utilize from a program, you can create a queue, which is a, you know, very popular tool, policy tool. If you create a long queue, for example, then only people who really need that will, you know, take the time and wait in that queue, basically. Of course, you know, whether it is sort of fair, whether it fits in their equity issues, well, it's another question. But still, you know, it is a tool to address those inefficiencies created by the moral hazard. Okay? Because in that case, those who are not needy, but still, you know, due to moral hazard want to benefit from the program, are not gonna wait. So here, there is an example here, a soup kitchen to support the needy. You can hire many workers, keep waiting times down, or hire few workers. Therefore, it's gonna be somewhat less costly, but then it's gonna produce, you know, long lines, long queues that people need to wait. But in that case, only who need are gonna wait. So that's a mechanism. And then, of course, the third one was to overcome the moral hazard. In addition to ordeal mechanisms and the categorical welfare programs, is the increasing the outside options, and it's basic, you know, making some outside options available to those, you know, who are targeted from these programs, like training, and, you know, labor market subsidies, childcare, child support. In a sense, like those are the programs that will get them out of the poverty, if the poverty is an issue here, out of the poverty in the long run. Also, like, you know, those outside options also make those guys less attractive to stay under the poverty line, if they are doing that on purpose, or, you know, with their choice. Because if you give them some training, if you give them some labor market subsidies that they can use in the labor market, they can get out of the poverty and, you know, have more income, and then, you know, you can use the rest of the money towards those who are really, you know, cannot even utilize those and go out of the poverty, if you have limited resources, basically. Now, what I want to discuss last is, we can skip those evidences, the evaluation of the 1996 welfare reform, which was done under the Clinton administration. Remember, Clinton was the president from 1992, November, or basically 1993, we can say, until the end of 2000. And under his administration, there was the so-called Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which created huge sort of discussions and fights within the Democratic Party, and some politicians or even cabinet members under the Clinton administration who are on the left of the Democratic Party, you know, not on the center of the party, but on the left of the party, have resigned from those positions, including, for example, the Secretary of Labor at that time, Robert Reich, who is currently a professor of economics at University of California, Berkeley, an economist, and who was a close friend of Clinton. They say, like, you know, to some extent, Clinton has betrayed those on the left of the party anyway, because, you know, we'll see that after the reform, the welfare payments, in terms of, you know, the amount of the welfare payments has gone drastically down. That is why. And what did this act do? This act basically changed several things. Of course, you know, we cannot summarize all here, but the main points is cash welfare was changed from an entitlement to a block grant. States were allowed and encouraged to experiment with alternative structures of cash welfare payments. Time limits were imposed on welfare recipients. You cannot utilize it all the time. Work requirements were imposed, and you know, new efforts to limit unwed motherhood were introduced. So it's basically, you know, a reform that was introduced somewhere around here in 1996, right here. And you see the big sort of decline, large significant decline in the number of people on welfare, from around, you know, 14 million or maybe 13 million in 1996 to right now around 4 million. And, you know, the population is growing, by the way. So it's not percentage, it is the absolute level of people utilizing these welfare programs. And, you know, because some of the increase here might be due to the population increase, and we have an absolute decline here, and in terms of percentage of the population, the decline is much more drastic because the population continues to grow up. So it's a huge sort of decline in the number of people utilizing those welfare programs. And that's why it also created a lot of criticism among, you know, the sort of the left of the Democratic Party, quite a lot. And the effect of these welfare reforms, so in a sense, of course, you know, the whole welfare reform, or the number of people who are utilizing these welfare programs, not all the decline can be attributed to the introduction of the welfare reform. Maybe, one can argue, you know, those guys, you know, the number of those guys has gone down because the economy was booming under the Clinton administration, which was true, by the way. And, you know, a significant fraction of people have gone out of poverty. That is why they are not relying on those welfare programs anymore, because they are not poor. They don't satisfy the criteria of being below the poverty line. That might be something that you can argue. But, sorry, here it's mentioned like about 1/3 of the decline in the welfare rolls can be ascribed to reform, with the rest due to the improving economy. So the idea here is, I haven't done this sort of calculation, but your textbook author is, you know, very, you know, prominent professor from MIT, he must be right, is arguing that, you know, only 1/3 of the decline is due to this reform program. The rest, the 2/3, is due to the growing economy. And now we are going to see, if this is the case, really, we are going to see after this crisis now, right now, when the unemployment rate is going to skyrocket in a short period of time, how many of those guys are going to fall back again below the poverty line. So that's sort of an issue that one needs to carefully look at. And despite the enormous reduction in use of welfare, single mothers as a group have not seen a drop in their income or their consumption. Okay, maybe it's because due to the growing economy, and there has been no noticeable effect of welfare reform on fertility rates, apparently. Was it a success or was it not was it a failure? The results are a bit mixed, but in a sense, of course, as I said, the results are mixed because some of those guys have gone out of the poverty, which most likely have increased their welfare, but also here, for example, especially for single mothers, on average, the incomes did not fall for single mothers, but it also didn't rise much either. And leisure clearly declined, so they are working more. Therefore, welfare should be going down, at least for single mothers. That is the idea here. And then that reform was passed during an economic expansion, so it is not maybe really a good time to see whether it reduced welfare or not, ceteris paribus. And the idea here is that the welfare system has not responded well to the deep recession that we have seen after 2008. Now, the final thing that I want to discuss in the next 3-4 minutes is this concept of universal basic income. It's a very popular tool nowadays, especially again in this public health origin crisis, which is basically an idea of guaranteeing a level of income to all citizens, or maybe even residents. It was basically a policy tool that was also advocated a lot, maybe if you were following the Democratic primaries, by Andrew Yang, a candidate who later dropped out of the race eventually. He was also arguing in favor of a universal basic income. And it has been discussed to some extent during the debates. Some economists are in favor of that, some economists are against that. Some economists argue that one should sort of get rid of all these welfare programs, and just sort of introduce this universal basic income guarantee. And because universal basic income guarantee means guaranteeing a specific level of income for all the citizens or even residents, as I said. So let's say $1,000 per month to everyone, or maybe $1,500, so that they are going above poverty line. Of course, one big question is how are you going to finance it? And people who are advocating the introduction of universal basic income are arguing that if you introduce this universal basic income, you can basically eliminate, if not all, most of the poverty or welfare programs, and then you are going to save a lot of money from there, and then you can use all this money, maybe some additional money as well, in introducing this. Okay, so no strings attached. That's why it's called universal. You don't need to be above something. You don't need to be in a category or something. You don't need to be a single mother. You don't need to be a student. Everyone is gonna get that. That's why it's called universal. So that's sort of a very progressive and popular policy tool. Whether it is effective or not, the results are mixed because no country truly have introduced us right now. But one thing that we can use maybe as a sort of a proxy for universal basic income, even though it's not exactly the same, is this Alaska permanent fund dividend and the effect of it on labor supply. Because one could argue, okay, if you guarantee this income to everyone, the labor supply is going to go down drastically. But the result from this Alaska permanent fund dividend is that Alaska is, let me just give you sort of the background story here. Alaska is rich in oil, as you know, and the state is earning a lot of money out of this oil fund. Of course, now the oil prices are going down. It's going down further. That's why state of Alaska has cut bunch of funding to universities. It's another story. But in a sense, the idea is that whatever they earn out of this, net the expenses, they are giving them equally distributing them to Alaskans. So dividend annually leaves 15,000 to 25,000 Alaskans out of poverty. So they are just the government is paying a check all the Alaskans out of the profits they earn from this oil revenues. That's why Alaska is the most equal state in the nation in terms of income distribution. But the more important thing is that, so in this graph, we are looking at two Alaska. One, the real Alaska, after the introduction of this government checks in 1981. We are looking at two Alaska. One is the true Alaska right now, the real Alaska. The other one is a synthetic Alaska, which does not give those payments. How do you calculate the synthetic Alaska? It's another story. I'm not gonna again, tell the details, but there is a statistical way of doing that. The synthetic Alaska is the Alaska which did not introduce those oil payments in 1981. The blue Alaska is the real Alaska which has introduced those payments. And we see, if you look at the employment rate, there isn't much a difference between those two Alaskas. So it did not reduce the labor supply, apparently, significantly. Maybe in certain years it did, but not significantly. On average, it did not. So that is why, one cannot argue that it is it's going to reduce labor supply. One criticism towards TANF was that reducing labor supply, creating inefficiency. But this is not the case with Alaska, and giving them some basic income. That is why some people argue that that this is gonna work out. Of course, how much it's gonna cost? For example, in US, if you're just giving it to US citizens but not residents, it's 1.5 trillion per year. It's almost this 2 trillion package that people are now discussing. The Congress is discussing to address the crisis. It's about the same as the Medicare and Medicaid programs combined in US, which is quite huge. Some people argue that we can't create a universal child benefit, like you can just pay the kids up to a certain age, 18, 15, 12, whatever, and then at least you can guarantee some sort of level of income for the kids. That's sort of, in a sense, that's sort of a special case of the universal basic income story. Okay, so I conclude the lecture right now here. So we are done with chapter 17. We have discussed small section of the poverty handbook, and I will continue with the chapter on public goods, which I think is chapter 7, from the next lecture onwards. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me via email anytime. Thank you for listening. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay strong. Bye bye.